Hey guys, so I just wanted to kind of go over the notes with you guys. I'm going to try and make this quick and not a really long video. Um, so let's go ahead and get to it. Okay, sorry. Um, okay, so monarchs and power. So this entire thing in notes is really just about the monarchs and groups of leadership in Europe versus the church. So we see an extension of royal law and justice. These governments, monarchs and nobles, are trying to limit the power of the church. We know that after the Crusades, the church was like the most powerful thing in Europe at that time. So they developed bureaucracies, which are groups of nobles. They owned land, wealth, things like that. They had a tax system put in place to collect money from those nobles. They also develop a justice system, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. They create larger armies, and England's the first country to have a centralized government. William the Conqueror. So William the Conqueror was this guy from northern France. He was a noble. He was of royalty, and one of his parents were from England. The other one was from France. And so what happens is at the time the King of England dies, and they were feuding over who the next leader of England should be. So there's a dispute as to who the leader should be. William thought that he had a claim to be the English king, even though he was not from England. So what he does is he invades England. So he goes across the English Channel and invades England via ship. He fights Harold, who is also trying to become the King of England, and this battle becomes known as the Battle of Hastings, probably one of the most famous battles in medieval times. This victory that William secures in the Battle of Hastings kind of cements his legacy. He was already known as a really good military strategist, but after the Battle of Hastings, it kind of put him in legendary status. So he becomes known as William the Conqueror because he invades England, and he's the first person to really do that successfully. He was unpopular in England. The British people did not like William because he was not British. He was from Normandy. He was a Frenchman. To kind of give you an idea of that, that'd be like having a Canadian be president of the United States. Like Canadians say a and sorry, and they apologize for everything. So we're different people. So it'd be like a Canadian becoming U.S. president. That's kind of how the people of England felt, is that William wasn't an Englishman, so he shouldn't be king. But he did become a successful king. And one of the things he was known for was establishing the Doomsday Book. And the Doomsday Book was a census. So a census is, how many people live in your dwelling? Do you own your dwelling? Do you rent it? What other things do you own? Do you own livestock, land, whatever it is? And they wrote all this stuff down in a big book. And then that way, when people died, they could make sure that that would be passed down to the correct people, or it could be sold, or whatever. So it was the first census that was really ever done in Europe. And you know what? We still do the census to this day. So even here in the United States, we do a census. In fact, there's one going around right now. You've probably seen the banners over Broadway by the stoplights. If you're going to 30 from Broadway from the school, you'll see they have those banners at the stoplights that say, like, fill out your census 2020. Okay, so that idea is still around to this day. So England, this is discussing England. So Henry II tries to create a court system outside of the church. So the way that it worked before is the court system was a religious thing. It was done by religious figures, clergymen, priests, clerics, and Henry wanted to establish a court system that was outside of the church. The main reason he wanted to do that is because he wanted to try clergy members and members of the church in court, but you really wouldn't get a good trial because it was run by the church. So he wanted to establish a court outside of that. So one of the main things that happens in Henry's leadership, Henry II's leadership, is Thomas Becket was the Archbishop of Canterbury. So he was like the religious figure in England, and he opposed Henry II's leadership. So they were like political rivals. And so what ends up happening is Thomas Becket ends up being murdered in Canterbury, and four knights murder him. And the church accuses Henry II of, ordering his assassination, ordering that he would be killed. and Henry, denies it. He's like, I didn't do that. So that's kind of what happens there. And after, Thomas Becket is murdered, the next person that gets put into the position of archbishop kind of was looking over their shoulder, and it eased the attempts to regulate clergy. So after that, Becket was murdered. It eased the attempts to regulate the clergy or try and control them because he didn't necessarily oppose Henry II. Okay, King John. So what King John is known for is he is the king that was forced to sign the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta was a document that gave rights to nobles and other people in England. And even to this day, the Magna Carta is probably one of the most important documents that's ever been drafted or created. In fact, the Magna Carta is still used and all throughout Europe, and even parts of our U.S. Constitution actually come from the Magna Carta. But King John, he rejects Pope Innocent's nominee for uh, Archbishop in England. And so the Pope excommunicates King John. And when he excommunicates him, he places an interdict on England, which meant that he was taking away those religious things, so like absolution, confirmation, those things. So John had to accept England as a fief of the Pope and pay a fee. So the Pope charged King John for the land, which is England, and he had to pay a fee to the Catholic Church in order to be the leader of England. So that's kind of what sets this up. And this ends up leading to kind of like a civil war in England over this idea of the Pope having more control of England than the actual king does. Okay. Okay, so in France, you have Hugh Capet. He's elected by feudal lords. He makes the throne in France hereditary. Before, up to this point, every time a king would die, it would be like a competition amongst nobles to gain the leadership of the country. Hugh Capet makes it hereditary. So Hugh Capet's son would become the next king, and then his grandson would be the next one, and that was the idea behind it. He wins over the support of the church, so the Catholic Church was very supportive of Hugh Capet as the leader of France, and he builds an effective bureaucracy. So all is well in France. But then eventually what happens, you have conflict with the Pope. So eventually that grandson, Philip IV, extends the royal power, and he makes new taxes. And the taxes that he put into place were on clergymen. Like he tried taxing the church. And so the Pope, Boniface, said that he could not tax the clergy, that it was against God's will to tax religious figures. But remember, at this time, the Catholic Church is like a leadership group. It's not only just a church, but it's actually the leadership of all of Europe. So King Philip threatens to arrest clergymen who refuse to pay taxes. And the Pope's like, you can't do that. If you do that, I'm going to excommunicate you. So King Philip just sent it. He went full tilt, and he sends the army to capture the Pope. So he sends troops into Lombardy, which is like northern Italy, southern France, and he captures the Pope. And he says, you're not the Pope anymore. And he elects a French nobleman to be the new Pope. So then he releases Pope Boniface, and Pope Boniface goes back to Rome. But now there's a Pope in Rome, and there's a Pope in Avignon in France. So there's two popes. You had a Pope in France and then a Pope in Italy, and this was a rival to the Pope in Rome. So this establishes a new point in the Catholic Church where you don't have a new like branch of Christianity being created, but you actually have two popes, and this becomes a very important thing moving forward in Europe. Okay, so the Holy Roman Empire. So you have Pope Gregory versus Henry IV, and this pretty much what happens here is, again, you're seeing a similar trend here that the emperor, the king, or the leader is feuding with the Pope. So you're starting to see all these leaders feud with the Catholic Church. So Gregory bans investure against the emperor, and the emperor's like, listen, this is what I'm going to do. I don't want to get excommunicated anymore, so I'm going to hire clergymen to work in my leadership group. And I'm going to pay, if they pay me, I'll make them a part of the nobility in my court. And the Pope's, you can't do that. And Henry is like, yeah, well, that's what I've been doing. I'm going to continue to do that. So Henry argues that the clergy's land is a fief. So he says, like, hey, we pay you money, and that's for the land. And so I'm the leader of this land. I give you guys money, so I can do whatever I want. And Pope Gregory excommunicates Henry, and Henry goes on this long repenting for his sins. He does this march through Rome. He puts on like regular clothes, not like a big cloak, but he wears just like basic clothing with like no shoes, no nothing, and he walks through the snow through the Vatican to repent for his sins, and Gregory forgives him. The Pope forgives him, and this was like the ultimate symbol of you have a king, right? Like he lives in a castle, and he normally wears a crown and all this stuff, and he's walking barefoot through snow, begging for forgiveness. So this was shown as a power was definitely with the church, and this was a pretty notable thing that the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire wasn't really all powerful in himself. He was actually just a part of the Catholic Church. Okay. So hopefully that kind of helps you guys break this down. The thing that I want you to take away from these notes is that in Europe at this time, you have kings and emperors, but you have popes and cardinals and clergymen and figures in the church. And it was a struggle between the church and the leaders, and the struggle between them led to lots of different conflicts and wars. But ultimately, what ends up happening is if you go through and count these up, there was only one king that showed more power over the church than all the other ones, and that was in France. And that was with Philip IV. And if you remember from the Crusade notes, Philip IV was the same person that left the Crusades and went back to France to go take land from the British. So he was kind of a dominant, all-powerful figure. And yeah, so hopefully that helps you out. I'm going to post this along with the notes. You can copy down the additional slides. Your slideshow assignment is due by midnight Friday night. So make sure you get that done. I was looking at some of them. Some of them were already done. I had a couple people finish that whole thing, and that's great. If you did not finish it, just make sure you finish it up by Friday night. And yeah, if you guys need anything, email me or send me a private message on Google Classroom, and I'm more than happy to help you. Okay, stay safe out there. Bye, guys.